Okay, so more important stuff. So I asked you guys, do you know the 2 notices that you use to end a tenancy? This is one of them. Section 8 notice. What is a Section 8 notice? Does anybody here know what a Section 8 notice is? Okay, Section 8 notice is a notice that relies on one of 17 grounds under the 1988 Housing Act that allows us to apply for possession of a property under an assured short-hold tenancy. Now, the grounds are split into 2 sections: mandatory grounds and discretionary grounds. Now, what does that mean? Well, what mandatory means is if you are able to prove that the ground you are citing applies and all of the boxes, remember what Sally said to you earlier about paperwork and boxes being ticked, all of the boxes have been ticked and you have the right to use this notice and you're using it in the correct format and you've served it in the correct day and you've left the right amount of days notice for service and you can prove that you have done all of this, then you can ask for your tenants to leave. So 1 to 8 is a mandatory ground. If you get in front of a judge and your ground applies on that day in court, the judge has to give you a possession order. Now, I have a lovely gentleman here called Basil, who I went to court with a few years ago. Do you remember Basil? And we went on a mandatory ground. And it was Christmas time, wasn't it, Basil? There you go. And the judge in Wolverhampton Council felt so sorry for this poor tenant that we actually had turned up, Basil, myself and a colleague, we turned up with the evidence that this tenant has not paid her rent for 4 months. I think we were at about 4 months by the time we got to court. 4 months. Now what they do is they write to you and they say, please submit all of your evidence with your court papers, and they write to the tenant and they say, please let us know if you have a defence. And what they're supposed to do is, that's what they're supposed to do. If there's a defence, it's meant to be done before we are in front of the judge. So the judge can look at all of the facts and make a decision. Now what I'm telling you here is on a mandatory ground, the judge should and must award possession. Now on this particular case, the tenant turned up, got the free advice from the lovely people that sit at the courts helping these people for free. And she came in and she said, I did pay my rent on that day, they're lying. And we tried to say to the judge, but sir, she should have provided, no, I will not have you talking in my court. I hereby give you 14 days to provide me with that receipt. So we were sat there and we were like, no, this is not right, but you can't argue with the judge. We tried, didn't we, Basil? But I nearly got done in contempt in court. I was actually really scared. Can't argue with them. So what you're probably thinking is 14 days is not very long. But remember what date we told you it was? Christmas. So 14 days wasn't 14 days. And also at the moment, the time that we are waiting for a court date in any application for possession is an average of 4 to 6 weeks. And it's actually teetering on the later, which is 6 weeks. So not only did he have to wait 14 days, he then had to wait for a new court date, which was another 4 to 6 weeks. And in this time, guess what? Did the tenant produce the receipt to prove that she paid the rent? Of course she didn't, because she never paid the rent. So we went back to court eventually and we got possession. So what's the point of this story? Because I'm telling you this is a mandatory ground. I'm just showing you how tough it is at the moment. And that was by doing everything right. 9 to 17 are discretionary grounds. What does that mean? That means that if you go to court on a discretionary ground, it's up to the judge on that day whether he gives you possession. So what we say to landlords and what our advice is and what most landlord and tenant lawyers' advices are, don't go to court on a discretionary alone, because you have no guarantee that you will win. You have no guarantee that you will get possession. And therefore, when we go on to talk about Section 21 notice, if we are on an AST and we are able to do so, it's much safer to use a Section 21 notice that the tenant really doesn't have as much defence to in a court of law. It doesn't mean, though, that you can't cite mandatory and discretionary grounds, because the one thing that we use this notice for most is rent arrears. There's lots of different things that you can use it for, and I'll show you a brief list that in a minute, but there's lots of different things. But the main one that is used in this country is rent arrears. So if your tenant is in 2 months rent arrears, or 8 weeks if the rent is due weekly, you can serve a Section 8 notice using mandatory ground 8, and what we then do is we bolt on 10 and 11, which are discretionary grounds in relation to rent arrears. Why do we do that? Why we do that is because mandatory ground 8 states that the tenant has to be 2 months in arrears when you serve the notice, first requirement, but they also must be 2 months in arrears on the day you arrive in court. So I've told you guys before about a how to rent guide that you give to tenants now legally at the start of the tenancy. What do you think that is? It's a Bible of telling them everything they need to know about a tenant. So what will a clever tenant do if you've only used mandatory ground 8? They'll pay 50 quid or a tenner on that day, and you're now below that mandatory ground. You've got nothing else to rely on in court. You may as well go home, because he's not going to award, because you are not meeting the requirements of mandatory ground. Now, we had a really funny case once. Well, it wasn't funny actually, but be careful. Have any of you ever had tenants that have changed their standing order date? Has that ever happened to you? Yeah? On this case, what happened was we'd had a tenant that changed a standing order date. And the amount of money that they needed to pay was something stupid like £169.97. Well, of course, they came into the office and what did they pay? They paid £170, didn't they? Because we haven't got 3p change. So what that meant was the tenant was in credit by 3p. So when they started to not pay their rent and we got to 2 months, we were 3p short of the mandatory ground, and we had to wait 3 months before we could apply for that. So bear that in mind. Never allow tenants to sit in very small credit, because if they do stop paying the rent, it really can extend the time that you have to wait before you can serve notice. And that 3p was the worst 3p of my life. So now, you guys don't know, but where's the property management? Farhan, what do we have in our office now? When a tenant is in arrears of, let's say, 1p, 20p, what have we got on our desk? We have an arrears pot, and we take the 3p out there and we go up to our accounts department and we say, we're going to pay this tenant's rent. And they look at us and say, you really want me to bank 3p? And I'm like, yep, I do. Get it off that ledger, please, because we don't want it. Because we've learned from this lesson. Now, when you serve a Section 8 notice, none of you guys even knew what one was, so I recommend none of you serve one first and foremost. You either need an agent or a solicitor. But when you do serve a Section 8 notice, there's lots of things that you need to consider. There's lots of boxes that you need to tick. It needs to be served in a correct way, prescribed form. You can't just get an A4 piece of paper and write Section 8, I give you 2 months notice. Doesn't work. You have to cite the grounds in full. You have to give the appropriate notice period. So as you can see up there, 1 to 5 are prior notice grounds. That means those grounds, if you are going to rely on them, the tenant must have been warned about prior to the start of tenancy. So of course, what do we do with those grounds? We put them in the agreement. They're in the agreement so that if we ever need them, they're in there and they've been notified. When you serve a Section 8 notice, you have to allow the tenant a 14-day grace period to pay up. So that's why it says you have to allow 14 days for them to act on that notice and pay you what they owe you. You also have to allow 2 days for service, 2 working days for service. Don't get the service days wrong, because it can be very costly, because your notice will be invalid. So 2 days notice, working days for service. So after we've served a Section 8, in general, 16 days later, if the tenant has made no payment, the landlord or us as your agent will be saying to you, we now recommend you act. And at that point is where we start looking at submitting an application to court for possession. Now, some landlords say, why don't we give them a little bit longer? Have you just forgot what I told you, that we've got to wait 6 weeks for a court hearing? Do you really want to give them a little bit longer if they're not paying you? On average, if a tenant stops paying rent, and I mean stops paying completely, you are on average looking between 4 and 6 months before you get possession, because of the timescales that you have to follow with the process. So what that means is that you are without rent for the whole of that time, unless you have opted to take rent guarantee, which I recommend all of you do. I really strongly do. Because not only will that guarantee that you've still got your rental income coming in, but it covers all of your legal costs. Does anybody know how much the court fee is at the moment? It was, again, let's go back in time, just 1 year or 2 years, it was £175. It's now £355. They've nearly doubled that cost alone. So you're not getting no rent in, now you've got to pay the court fee, and then if you don't know what you're doing, you've got to pay a solicitor to attend as well. Now, we wish a solicitor would cost £355, but you're probably looking somewhere in the region between £600 and £1,200, depending on attendance at court and how good they are. So guys, if you haven't already got rent guarantee, if you haven't already got these things covered, look at it. Look at it now and look at it at your next let if it's not available to you now. Because trust me, I am experiencing this frequently. Not every tenant, but when it does happen, it's painful. And it really is. And that's a landlord's most vulnerable time because they're angry, they're frustrated. And then guess what? We've got Farhan then ringing him up going, "Hi, you all right?" "Yeah, I'm great, Farhan." "Boiler's broke in this property down the road." "Well, I'm not fixing that. She ain't paid me no rent for 3 months. I'm sorry, but you've got to." "You're telling me I've got to fork out £1,700, £2,000 and she's not paid?" Yep. Because if you don't, they will defend in court with the non-repairing claim. You do not want the tenants to have any defence in court when you get there. Think of arriving in court as a privilege. You've already waited 6 weeks. You don't want there to be the case where we were. You do not want the tenant to have a defence. So I'm sorry, guys. Sorry, landlords. You do have to maintain your repairing obligations under Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, even if the tenant is not paying rent. And I know that's the point where you probably most likely don't want to do it. But it's actually the most important time to do it. It can be served by hand delivered, but please make sure you've got evidence of this. And if you are hand delivering it, it needs to be before 4 o'clock and it's still 1 working day for service. Now, do you send it, if you send it by post? Who here thinks we need to send it recorded delivery? Put your hand up. Yeah, most of you. Absolutely not. Because if your tenant is not paying the rent, and they see a lovely letter pop through the door that's recorded delivery, and the man turns up and he says, "Can you please sign for this?" What are you going to say? "No, thanks." You're not going to sign for it. You're not going to sign for it because you know it's something you don't want to receive. First class post. Okay, because that is legal postage. I recommend you obtain proof of postage. So what we do is we photocopy our envelope, we attach it to the Section 8, and that's our evidence. Evidence it, but first class post is the best way because they cannot deny receiving it. So again, recorded delivery is not the right way to do it. Any questions on Section 8? I know that's quite a hefty thing. Yes, sir?
Is it wise to back it with an email? Because some emails you can get proof of it sent and read.
Yeah, well, again, this is another thing that they're so far ahead of every other regulation, but they don't seem to have caught up that we've now got emails. And emails are fantastic, they're quick, they're easy, there's no need for 2 days service. There's no actual case yet to say that notice served via email has been stood up in court, it is valid. However, what we do is we do send it via email, but we still back it up with the post. Because if you do it via email and the post fails or something, if you turn up at court and say, "Look, here's my evidence, there's the email, date, stamped and time, sent to that person, you know, they've received and responded to all other emails, I believe they've had it, and here's also my evidence of postage," the judge will look and he'll think, "You are not lying, you're telling the truth." There's no harm, absolutely not. But one of the things I would recommend is if you are going to be communicating with tenants by email, get their permission to do so and get an email address where they give you permission to talk to them through. It was really funny actually because we served something once and I can't remember what it was, but I found it hilarious. The tenant denied receiving it, but they'd responded to the email with a question that I'd asked in it. So I was like, how did you not receive the attachment? That was it, there was an attachment. We didn't get that one. But you answered the question within the content of the email, so how did you not get it? Any other questions about Section 8? Yes, Tony.
Loss of rent normally covered in your property owner's insurance?
No. This is another big myth. A lot of landlords don't believe that they're covered for loss of rent in their insurance. Loss of rent in an insurance policy, I'm not going to say categorically, but normally means that if your property becomes uninhabitable and you have to rehouse your tenant, or your tenant doesn't need to pay rent for a period of time due to something that's happened which is insurable, they will cover your loss of rent for that period. It doesn't mean if your tenant doesn't pay, Tony, we'll pay it for you. Because don't forget, your insurance hasn't assessed the criteria of the tenant. It's assessed the criteria of you as the landlord and is based on that as such. So if I took car insurance out, they're basing it on my no claims, they're basing it on my length of driving, they're basing it on my age, now that I'm older, they're basing it on everything to do with me. So if Preet wanted to drive my car, who hasn't passed the test and everything else, it wouldn't be fair for her to get in the car and say, well, I'm covered under Dawn's, because it's two very different things. So a lot of landlords believe they are covered for it in their insurance, but I would be very surprised, and I'd say it will be very, very minimal if you are. Just so that you can see, these are the grounds that we can choose to pick from in order to use for possession. So as you can see, some of them are not all horrible. So for example, ground 5, I like that one. If the property was rented to a minister of a church and the minister ended his, whatever he does, ministry, and that property was in relation to that job, you'd use ground 5 to end that tenancy. Ground 7, if your tenant dies, don't think you get possession of your property just because they've died. It doesn't happen like that. You've still got to go through the process of obtaining possession. The easiest way to obtain possession when a tenant has died, if you are unfortunate enough to have a nice tenant that's died, that we have, is through their next of kin and ending it via negotiation. But you have to make sure that the person that you're dealing with is the executor of the will and has the power to do so. Now, just because your tenant dies, it also doesn't mean that the rent due dies, of course, because if the tenancy has to continue, then the rent is still due and the estate would be responsible for that amount. But the easiest way when a tenant dies is just do it by negotiation, arrange to get the tenant's stuff out of there and end the tenancy by way of deed of surrender. This can actually be a really big problem. We've experienced it, haven't we, Farhan? When tenants have died in the past and you don't have their next of kin and you can't make any contact, and it can be a problem. And then here we've got the rent arrears ground 8, 11, 12 is a breach of tenancy. But as you can see, the majority of them, 9 to 17, where some of these are actually quite serious, are discretionary grounds.